any mistakes that you actually have made at Sequoia so far?
The biggest one would be, that's based on current market cap or current situation, would be Make My Trip. You could argue Flipkart is a mistake. We saw it when it was a really, really young company. It was probably a few $1 million of market cap.
Why didn't you bet on Flipkart or Make My Trip?
You can't get them all right. You see many of the situations, you are not convinced for different reasons of market. As Mr. Devesh was saying, all these companies in the early stages don't look very pretty. And you have to they keep making losses for several years. Flipkart is still hugely loss-making.
Do you not believe in the Indian e-commerce story? Do you have reservations and apprehensions? Because that seems to have been the darling of investors over the last 24 months.
I wouldn't say we're not believers of e-commerce business. We believe that the e-commerce business in India is a lot tougher than what people believe. There's a lot of exuberance around sales, but no one has been focused on building profitable businesses or even seeding the seeds of profitability. I do believe that all these businesses will be loss-making for a very long time. China's leading e-commerce company, 360buy, has about $4 or $5 billion of revenues and makes losses. So we're very far away from there. So we will be loss-making for quite some time, but at least you should start seeing some semblance of how the margin structure is changing and moving towards profitability. If you do not see that, and we are not seeing that yet in India, you worry. That's what investors started realizing around about 12 months back, that we're all getting carried away by sales growth. And the excitement in China in particular, and we should temper down that that excitement, and that's what's happened.
Over the last 24 months, we've also seen jaw-dropping valuations. Whether they're true or not is a different story altogether, but that's what was talked about. Has the valuation scenario changed now?
We've had an example, and I won't give the name of the company, where we gave a term sheet at $150 million. And within 6 months doing diligence, the valuation came down to about $35 million. So the same companies, same business, that was the drop in valuation. So it's become a lot more sane, a lot more disciplined, and I'm glad that's happened.
So you've invested $1 billion in India so far. What's the outlay that you have for, say, the next 2 years or 5 years?
So we do not think of a 5-year outlay, but we think of our annual business. We have been investing roughly about, give or take 10%, $200 million a year every year in India. And we believe that we'll continue the same pace.
So when is the earliest that you actually see some of these companies heading the IPO route?
I don't see many of these younger companies heading the IPO route for a while. Many of them have strategic interest. They may get bought out. On the consumer side, you'll file interest even for a 150 crore revenue company. So those are hot. They'll still go through. Technology will be tougher, and forget everything else.
Is it hard to find good businesses in India today?
It's always been hard to find good businesses.
Thank you very much for joining us here for the 3rd Young Turks Conclave. It's been a pleasure, and we hope that we will hear more about the companies that you invest in here in India. Thank you very much.
Thank you. My pleasure. Thank you so much.
I was reading a provocative book. Why provocative, you ask? Because sample this. As most economists are busy writing obituaries of the empire, he says America can be a breakout nation and the US economy will grow faster than the global average for the first time since 2003. Here's more. He says the idea of BRICS was a good marketing concept. And what about India? He says today we're back to a situation where it takes effort to sell India. An economist, now author, with a keen interest in politics and sprinting, and this is a fact that I've just discovered while I was reading up on him. I believe he represented India in the World Masters, a track and field event for men and women over 35 in Sacramento, participating in both the 100-meter and the 400-meter events. Ladies and gentlemen, Ruchir Sharma.
Thank you very much. Great to be here. India was just about opening up to the world back in '91. I had a really keen interest in what was happening in the global economy. So I started writing for the Economic Times. They did not know what my background was. I wanted to use economics as a tool for investing. But at that age, I didn't have the money to invest, or there's nobody who would give me a job to invest. But I thought that the best way to express that was through writing. And since then, writing has become a really it's a habit. It's one of those things that you have to get out of your system. Every month, I must write something. And so therefore, for 20 years, I think without fail, I've written something for some publication in the world every single month. I believed that I had a book in me. But for a long time, I kept thinking as to what should be the theme of this book. And the couple of people who I was speaking with about this, who had written successful books, told me that, listen, when you want to write a book, make sure that you have a grand unifying theory. There's no point writing something which is just about your observations of the world here, there, and the other, because that was pretty easy to do. But in 2010, a few things happened which sort of got me to write this book. I've always been a keen reader of economic history, and one observation struck me, which is that at the start of every decade, there is some theme which captures the imagination of the world. And by the time that decade is over, that theme is no longer relevant. So if you look at the start of the previous decade in 2000, the big theme that we were all in awe of was the TMT theme, tech, media, telecom, and about technology. So what was the big theme in 2010? It struck me that the theme that everyone seems to be convinced about is this rise of emerging markets, and particularly the rise of the BRICS. That's all that they wanted to speak about how BRIC was going to conquer the world. And yet, I mean, as an investor, what we try and do is to look for the flaw in the conventional argument, also to see as to what can go wrong with some belief that has become so strong. And that's when 2 to 3 incidents happen which sort of got me thinking that this BRIC and this rise of all emerging markets is not going to play out the way that we are imagining it will. That there are fundamental flaws in this argument, and this is not the history of economic development. They look at the history of economic development. There are 180 countries today tracked by the IMF. Only 35 are developed. Balance are emerging, and many of them have been emerging forever, right? So you get countries like Brazil, they'll have one good decade. After that one good decade, they will have 2 bad decades. You'll have Mexico, something similar will happen. All these countries will sort of have spurts of growth, but they're not able to sustain that spurt for any length of time. And yet, because all emerging markets had done so well over the past decade, we were all sort of believing about how all these countries were going to rise, and many of them were going to conquer the world. So in October 2010, I was invited to Moscow. And it was at the behest of the President Putin. Those days he was the Prime Minister. So I was invited to Moscow to present to him in terms of what are my thoughts on the Russian economy. So I started this presentation, and I had no idea that this was going to be telecast live in Russia. It was a fairly frank commentary about Russia, about how what worked for Russia a decade ago will not work for Russia today, that it's impossible for an economy to sort of grow further at this per capita income level when the only thing they have is really oil and gas and consumption-related stories on the back of oil and gas. It all seemed to be going okay. Putin was sitting there taking notes, and he referred to it in the Q&A. We had a discussion about it. Next day when I woke up, I was just shocked to see my inbox, because it was crowded with messages from worried people in my firm, sending me messages that, what have you said in Moscow? And their sort of point was that the entire Russian media, which is controlled by the Kremlin, had gone hammer and tongs after me to attack me as to how I had spoiled the party. And the common line was that, who needs your money? That was a fairly sort of arrogant attitude, I thought, that I got to see. And that's the kind of stuff that we know is a fatal flaw of many countries. Soon after that, we had a client conference. And I asked Bush about Putin, that, listen, what happened to Putin? Because in a decade ago, you had said that I looked him in the eye and I saw a friend. I said, do you still believe in this about this guy? So Bush said no. He said that when I first met Putin in the year 2000, he wanted to talk to me about Russia, what should we do about Russia's debt, and the price of oil in the early 2000s was $25 a barrel. He was paranoid that what if the price of oil goes to $15 or $20 a barrel? How will Russia cope in that sort of environment? Flash forward to when I'm leaving office in 2008, and I meet Putin, and Putin then is asking me about my mortgage-backed securities. I'm going to check on you as to what, how your mortgage-backed security is doing. He said that when Bush had called Putin to the White House back in the early 2000s, Bush's dog was playing there in the lawns. And Bush sort of introduced his dog Barney to Putin. Putin looked at it, didn't comment much. Okay, act one, scene one, done. Then he says, when I meet Putin in his dacha in 2008, just before the financial crisis, in the first part when the price of oil was $130, $140 a barrel, Bush basically sort of is there, and Putin goes to him, do you want to meet my dog? So Bush says, okay, let's meet your dog. And out comes this big dog called Corny. And Putin goes to him, see, bigger, better, stronger. Right? So that's how sentiment had turned as far as, like Russia was concerned. For all policymakers, as I conclude, the lesson really needs to be in this world that when there is no wind, row.